There's a unique kind of frustration that doesn't erupt in anger or tears. Instead, it lingers quietly inside you. You keep praying, you keep moving forward, you refuse to give up, but something feels different. It's not broken, just dulled, as if a mute button has been pressed on your spirit. This can be incredibly confusing because nobody ever prepares you for this stage. We're often told that growth should be unmistakable, that faith should feel strong and alive, and that progress always comes wrapped in clarity and certainty. But here's an unsettling truth to consider. What if the most crucial chapter in the Christian journey is actually the one that feels the least spiritual? The Bible tells stories of seasons drenched in stillness, times when no miracles burst forth, no crystal clear answers arrive, and no emotional surge confirms your prayers. Yet, those quiet seasons are woven throughout the narratives that matter most. That leads to an often avoided question among believers. What if what feels like a silent, uncomfortable stretch is not a failure, but a time of formation? If that makes you uneasy, good. Because once you recognize this phase for what it truly is, you can't ever unsee it. When silence starts to feel like slipping backwards, it's tempting to panic. I want to be transparent here. There comes a period in one's spiritual life defined by its discomfort precisely because of its quietness. The emotional highs fade. Answers become vague. Progress feels stalled. Prayer sessions grow shorter. Scripture appears lifeless, and awkward silence fills the gaps. Not the peaceful kind, but the uneasy kind. Many encounter this phase and jump to the conclusion that something has gone terribly wrong. Yet, biblical texts suggest another way to interpret this experience. Silence isn't merely absence. It's a divine presence that we often overlook. Numerous psalms reflect a voice that cries out, waits, and hears nothing in return. No thunderous reply, no profound reassurance, only patient waiting. The original context here is key. Faith was not an abstract concept. It was essential for survival. Still, God's response wasn't immediate. The silence wasn't abandonment, but an integral part of the story. This is a difficult reality for us today. We usually gauge spiritual growth by visible movement, by busy activity, by intense feelings, or undeniable clarity. But if we read Scripture carefully, we see that some seasons aren't about rapid progress. Instead, they teach us how to remain faithful, to persist in prayer when it feels unrewarding, to linger in Scripture when the words fail to leap off the page. I found myself asking, am I moving backward? But maybe that very question is the threshold to deeper understanding. Often, this phase appears unnoticeably amid everyday life. You still show up. You still believe. Yet, something inside you shifts. There's less rush, fewer dramatic breakthroughs, more pauses and hesitation. Decisions take longer to make. Faith becomes weighty, not in a burdensome way, but in a way that is more authentic, quieter, denser. And if it can feel utterly confusing, perhaps this stage isn't about feeling more connected to God. Rather, it's about learning to stay connected even when the feelings fade, to hold faith steady without constant reassurance. Which leads us to a crucial question worth pondering long and hard. One that deserves no rash answer. If growth made no noise, no fanfare, no emotional fireworks, would you still recognize it as growth? Because what lies ahead continues to challenge our usual ideas about progress. The desert is not a defeat. This might be a tough truth to admit, but it truly matters. The desert appears in Scripture far more frequently than the mountaintop, and never as a form of punishment. Instead, it serves as a classroom, a place no one volunteers for. When the Bible describes the wilderness, it's seldom in a romantic or poetic light. It's hot, dry, and monotonous. Days blur into one another. And the pressing question that lingers isn't what went wrong, but rather why am I still here? Take the journey of Israel after their escape from Egypt. Historically, this was a group of former slaves learning to live free, not just on the outside, but deep down within. The biblical text implies that the desert represents more than just geography. It's about transformation and formation. Despite receiving food, guidance, and even miraculous signs, the people struggled profoundly. Complaints arose, doubt crept in, and a nostalgic longing for the chains they left behind persisted. The desert exposed the wounds freedom hadn't yet healed, and facing that truth is uncomfortable. What's especially remarkable is how slowly everything unfolds. There are no shortcuts, no quick bursts of spiritual energy, just a steady rhythm of daily dependence. Manna can be stored for tomorrow. Water doesn't always arrive early. The lesson repeats intentionally, emphasizing that growth here is anything but thrilling. It's draining. Honestly, this is often the moment when many start questioning if God's voice slipped away somewhere along the path. In real life, this desert experience looks painfully ordinary. You do all the right things, but the momentum is missing. Progress seems frozen. Career choices feel murky. Relationships hover in a neutral zone. Not broken, just quiet and unremarkable. Spiritually, you're not in rebellion, but you're far from soaring. This in-between space messes with your mind, far more than outright failure ever did. Here's the crucial point many overlook. The desert isn't merely a pause between significant moments. It is the significant moment. It strips away attempts at performance. Sand doesn't respond to impressing or rushing. The desert teaches discernment, patience, and humility. Not through speeches or sermons, but through relentless repetition, through staying put, through enduring days that seem insignificant. It's where faith sheds its training wheels. Let me be clear, because this can be misunderstood. A point comes in the Christian journey when faith stops being carried and must start walking on its own. That stage feels awkward, unstable, and a bit exposed. Early in faith, belief often comes with structure, clear rules, strong emotions, swift reassurance. But Scripture indicates that these supports don't vanish abruptly. They gradually loosen. You can witness this in Jesus' relationship with his disciples. Initially, he explains, repeats lessons, demonstrates patience. Later, he responds to questions with questions, lets silence take the place of sermons, and calls for trust to replace proof. Culturally, this progression is logical. Rabbis don't just train students to memorize truth, they train them to embody it. Eventually, the teacher steps back, not to abandon, but to observe what has truly taken root. This phase is often when people feel strangely less spiritual. The goosebumps and dramatic moments fade. Prayer becomes more honest, but also plainer, sometimes like talking into open air. And it's in this very space that doubt quietly slips in. Not the loud, unmistakable kind, but the subtle, creeping kind. This is not a dramatic kind of crisis where someone storms out in anger. Instead, it's the quiet kind that prompts you to ask yourself, is this still working? In everyday life, this transition is subtle, yet deeply significant. Decisions begin to carry more weight. You can't simply quote a verse and move on. Instead, you have to think things through, discern carefully, and sit with the tension that arises. Faith starts to shape how you listen to others, how you navigate conflicts, and how you control your reactions, both at work and at home. It becomes less about saying the right things and more about gradually becoming a different kind of person. Here's the part that rarely gets talked about. This phase can feel lonelier, not because God is absent, but because your responsibility grows heavier. You can no longer rely on someone else's convictions or borrow certainty from others. It's yours now. And that's a lot to carry. Honestly, it can feel unfair, like being thrust onto a stage before you feel prepared. But maybe that very discomfort is a sign, not of loss, but of a transformation. The shift from borrowed faith to faith that belongs to you, from simply having answers to gaining wisdom. So here's a question worth holding on to as you move forward. If faith no longer feels easy, could it be because it's finally becoming yours? This quiet shift is about moving from feeling God's presence to trusting Him. Let me be honest. This is usually where frustration runs high, because most people aren't warned that this change is coming. At a certain point, the Christian journey switches from feeling God to trusting Him. These two are not the same. Feeling God is emotional. Trusting Him is relational. Scripture doesn't describe this change as a loss, but when you're in the midst of it, it definitely feels like one. If you look closely at the Gospels, especially the later stages of Jesus' ministry, you'll notice something striking. The crowds thin out, the miracles seem less frequent, and conversations become more solemn and weighty. The disciples aren't seeing less truth. Rather, they're being asked to live out that truth without constant signs and confirmations. In Jesus' cultural context, trust wasn't blind optimism. It was loyalty tested over time, especially under pressure. Often it's during this season that prayer changes tone. There's less excitement, more honesty, and sometimes fewer words. Long pauses may stretch out, feeling awkward, even pointless. You are no longer chasing a powerful emotional response, but you're also unsure what exactly you're supposed to be hearing. That tension can cause quiet panic, even if it never breaks the surface. In practical terms, this phase shows itself as restraint. You respond more slowly. You don't jump to conclusions or spiritualize every inconvenience. Faith becomes less dramatic and more woven into the fabric of your daily life. It influences how you deal with stress, manage disappointment, and wait through delays. It's not flashy or attention-grabbing. It's grounded, steady, and perhaps the least photogenic season of faith. Here's a hard truth many resist. Feelings make great indicators, but terrible foundations. Scripture suggests that true trust grows precisely when feelings stop leading the way, not because emotions are bad, but because they're unreliable. This phase is about learning steadiness rather than intensity, obedience without fanfare. And this is where things get real. There comes a phase in the Christian journey where obedience seems to fade into the background, unnoticed and uncelebrated. You keep doing the right things, but there's no applause, no visible benefits, no clear scoreboard keeping track. Life doesn't suddenly get easier. Sometimes it even becomes tougher. It's at moments like these when people begin to ask profound questions they never considered before. If you examine the biblical narrative carefully, you'll notice that obedience is rarely depicted as glamorous or rewarding in the immediate sense. Prophets obediently delivered messages but were often ignored. Kings did what was right yet still faced severe consequences. Even Jesus' teachings don't present obedience as a simple cause and effect bargain. It's not about doing something to receive something else in return. Instead, obedience is framed as alignment, a way of living that matches truth, regardless of the results it brings. In the cultural context of the biblical era, such obedience was countercultural. The world was obsessed with honor, recognition, and visible success. This quiet phase tests your true motives more than anything else. Are you obedient because it yields benefits, or simply because it is the right path? That's a tough question, especially when obedience demands sacrifices of time, comfort, reputation, or promising opportunities, and when shortcuts seem so benign. The tension here isn't dramatic or loud. It's steady, quiet, and draining. In everyday life, this unfolds in small, unnoticed decisions. Choosing honesty when silence could be easier. staying consistent in faith when no one is watching, and resisting compromises at work, even if it slows down progress. There is nothing heroic about this. It's repetitive and often feels thankless. Over time, the weight of this constant repetition can wear you down if you're expecting applause or visible success. Then a subtle transformation occurs, often without clear notice. Obedience shifts from being about results and outcomes to shaping your very character. You begin to choose integrity instinctively, not out of fear or reward, but simply because it is right. Scripture suggests this kind of obedience builds deep, inner strength rather than public recognition, and such depth rarely attracts crowds or fanfare. Now, when weakness stops being a problem, I'm about to say something that might sound puzzling at first. There comes a point in the Christian walk where weakness is no longer something you need to fix, not because it vanishes, but because its role changes. The Bible doesn't glamorize weakness, nor does it rush to erase it. In fact, some of the most transformative moments happen precisely when strength is exhausted and nothing immediately replaces it. The Apostle Paul, writing in a Greco-Roman culture obsessed with power, status, and eloquence, dared to admit weakness openly. In that context, revealing weakness was reckless, not humble. Yet, Paul embraced this vulnerability almost stubbornly, not as failure, but as a sacred space. A space where dependence on God grows and the grip of ego loosens. This phase can be unsettling because it strips away the illusion of self-sufficiency. You confront your limited energy, the inconsistency of your focus, the times when prayer feels powerless, and discipline doesn't guarantee clear answers. Rather than rushing to fix this discomfort, this stage invites you to live within it patiently and faithfully. In practical terms, weakness often reveals itself in the most everyday ways. You find yourself saying no more frequently. You will allow yourself to rest without feeling guilty. At least, you're learning to do so. Slowly, you stop pretending you're capable of managing everything on your own. And surprisingly, when you stop performing strength, your relationships tend to become healthier. Vulnerability ceases to be overly dramatic and instead grows into something honest and real. This is the turning point that many people overlook. Weakness actually reshapes how trust works. Faith shifts from a focus on what you can carry to what you're willing to let go of. Scripture suggests that relying too much on strength can hinder personal growth, while accepting weakness opens the door to new possibilities. This acceptance doesn't mean comfort. It means openness. Openness is about stepping forward even before everything makes perfect sense. This idea often catches us off guard. Somewhere along the way, we've come to believe that clarity should come first. Understand before you act. Feel sure before you move. But when we examine the biblical narrative closely, it's clear that order is flipped more often than we'd like to admit. Obedience frequently comes before explanation, movement before certainty. And that unsettles many, especially those who tend to think deeply. Take Abraham, for example. His story is frequently simplified, but the real impact is in the detail. In his time, leaving one's homeland meant more than just moving. It meant giving up security, family ties, and identity itself. The biblical text doesn't state that Abraham had the whole plan laid out. Instead, it shows he had a calling and a general direction, but no full roadmap. That difference is crucial. His faith wasn't reckless, but responsive. He stepped forward without all the information, and the meaning of his journey emerged along the way. Living this kind of faith feels risky because it means surrendering control. You can't wait until every fear is calmed or until you get guarantees. Prayer doesn't always clear the fog. Sometimes it only grants you permission to take the next step. This can feel almost irresponsible, especially if you've been taught that wisdom always demands certainty. In everyday life, this dynamic reveals itself in subtle but costly ways. Choosing to act with integrity, even if it might harm your career, ending a familiar but stagnant chapter of life, or beginning something small without any guarantee it'll work out. You're not being impulsive, but attentive. You're listening for alignment rather than assurance. This is a difficult line to walk. The internal transformation that happens gradually shifts faith from understanding specific outcomes to responding faithfully in the moment. Scripture seems to imply that clarity often emerges as a result of obedience, not as its prerequisite. This doesn't mean ignoring wisdom. It means acknowledging your limits and moving forward without seeing the whole picture, but never without purpose. When growth looks like loss, that's one of the most misunderstood and challenging parts of the journey to accept. There's a phase where growth doesn't add to your life, it subtracts. Roles you once held fall away, certainties begin to unravel, and things that once defined you quietly stop working. From the outside, it can appear as though you're declining, regressing, or shrinking rather than expanding and becoming more. Jesus points to this paradox multiple times throughout his teachings, emphasizing that true growth often comes through loss, not gain. When he talks about losing in order to find, or dying in order to truly live, these aren't just poetic phrases. They're profound challenges to first-century Jewish ideas about identity. Back then, identity was tightly wrapped up in family lineage, strict obedience, and visible signs of blessing. To say that loss could shape and form you was revolutionary. It turned everything on its head. This part of the journey often feels unsettling because the familiar markers you've relied on start to dissolve. You find yourself standing at a crossroads. You're less sure of yourself, yet far from faithless, less busy and driven, but certainly not disconnected. Some of your ambitions begin to fade, not because they were wrong or sinful, but because they no longer fit the person you're becoming. And that sparks difficult questions about who you really are without those goals. These aren't questions you can answer in a rush, even if you desperately want to. In practical terms, this stage might look like stepping back instead of charging ahead. You're saying no to opportunities you once eagerly pursued, releasing your grip on influence, recognition, and even plans you prayed fervently for. It's not about dramatic, headline-grabbing loss. It's about quiet, gradual release. That silence might feel like emptiness, unless you understand the deeper process at work. Here's the new way of seeing things that Scripture gently offers. Pruning isn't punishment. It's preparation. Growth that endures often needs space. And that space comes from what's removed. Not all loss means something's been taken away. Sometimes, you simply outgrow parts of your former self. Recognizing this is a maturity few openly discuss, the slow awakening of discernment. As you travel through these seasons, something subtle begins to take shape. It's not confidence or certainty, but discernment. And it doesn't erupt suddenly with fanfare. Instead, it grows quietly, almost unnoticed, like your eyes adjusting to dim light. You don't instantly know everything. You just start to perceive things differently. This change reshapes how you navigate the world around you. In the Bible, discernment rarely arrives as a flash of insight. More often, it's the product of steady walking, stumbling, waiting, and listening. Take Solomon's request for wisdom. He wasn't seeking magical, instant answers, but the practical ability to make fair judgments in complex human situations. His discernment was relational and grounded in real life, not mystical. This stage might feel anticlimactic. After experiences of loss, obedience without applause, and long silences, you might expect a sudden surge of crystal clear clarity. Instead, what unfolds is quieter. An internal compass. You start sensing when something feels off. You recognize when an opportunity, no matter how appealing, isn't truly right for you. even if you can't fully explain why. That can be frustrating. In day-to-day life, discernment appears in small, subtle ways. You don't feel the need to win every conversation anymore. You hesitate about decisions, not because of fear, but out of wisdom. You listen more and speak less. You begin to notice patterns not only in yourself but in others and in circumstances around you. Discernment doesn't erase uncertainty, but it equips you to move through it without panic or haste. Here's a surprising twist. Discernment often feels like restraint. You may have the power to act, yet you choose patience. You could speak out, but you wait. Scripture implies that maturity isn't about always doing more or acting faster. It's about knowing when to hold back and quietly trust the deeper process unfolding with it. Faith isn't about having a perfect reaction each time. It's about responding with intention. And that intention doesn't just appear suddenly. It develops gradually over time. So, let's hold on to this question without rushing to an answer. What if the clarity you've been yearning for has been quietly growing inside you all along? Imagine carrying faith without the need to validate or prove it. This is a subtler, quieter phase, one that often goes unnoticed. Faith evolves to a point where it no longer feels the urge to announce itself, defend its position, or convince anyone, including yourself. And oddly enough, this can feel unsettling at first. After all the struggle, the questions, the heavy internal wrestling, you might expect something more dramatic or loud. But what you're met with instead is calm. If you look closely at the later chapters of Jesus' life, especially as the story approaches the cross, you observe a significant shift. There are fewer words, less debate, and more simply being present. Within that cultural and literary setting, silence didn't signal weakness. It was a sign of steadfast resolve. It wasn't that Jesus stopped caring. Rather, he stopped arguing. The truth no longer needed guarding. Said he, it simply stood firm on its own. This stage of faith often confuses people because passion looks different now. You're not less committed or less engaged. You're simply less reactive. You don't feel compelled to constantly prove your beliefs through action or argument. You've come to realize that faith can be lived authentically, without performance. That realization can bring two very different feelings at once: freedom and loneliness. In everyday life, this mature faith reveals itself as steadiness. You no longer feel threatened by disagreement. You're comfortable not having the final word. Whether at work, at home, or in conversations about belief, you find yourself listening more and speaking less, not from uncertainty, but from a place of security. Your values guide you quietly and confidently, without begging for reinforcement. Scripture hints at this profound truth in subtle ways. Mature faith wields influence not through force or volume, but through consistency and quiet presence. But arriving here takes years, often passing through many earlier stages of growth. It's a moment in faith formation that rarely feels like a moment at all. No grand announcement, no emotional climax. Rather, it's a gentle, quiet realization that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. You begin to notice that you're different, not sharper, louder, or flasher. And in that, a profound truth dawns. Nothing was wasted. Not the silence, not the waiting, not the confusion. Looking back through Scripture, this pattern surfaces more often than we realize. The individuals who endured the longest seasons of waiting and hardship speak little of them afterward. Moses doesn't romanticize his desert wanderings. David doesn't glorify his time hiding in caves. Paul does not celebrate his periods of limitation. The biblical narrative doesn't portray these seasons as detours. It treats them as essential formation, growth that is slow and costly. What's remarkable about this realization is its ordinariness. You don't suddenly feel illuminated or transformed in some dramatic way. Instead, you simply respond to life differently than before. You pause before reacting, understand before judging, and move forward with a quiet strength. This is the heart of mature faith, a faith that stands steady and strong, shaped over time by every moment, every challenge, and every silent prayer. Before reacting impulsively, you will learn to pause and pray, even when emotions don't guide you. You start making choices rooted in who you've truly become, not in trying to prove something to others. This subtle alignment, quiet as it is, holds immense significance. In everyday life, its effects appear in unexpected ways. You manage disappointment without falling into chaos. You face uncertainty without giving in to fear. You embrace trust without insisting on guarantees. Faith transforms from fiery bursts of intensity into a steady endurance, shifting its focus from fleeting moments to a continuous posture of strength. This posture remains firm even when the situation doesn't shift immediately. And here lies a transformative realization. Growth isn't always about adding more. Sometimes it's about weaving everything together into a cohesive whole. The earlier phases of development don't vanish. Rather, they settle and combine to create a stable foundation, capable of bearing weight. Scripture suggests maturity is less about reaching a final destination and more about becoming ready for what lies ahead. Ultimately, this journey isn't defined by stages, labels, or deadlines. It's about understanding, recognizing that what once seemed like delays were actually depths, that what looked like losses were in fact the shaping of enduring stability. Growth quietly makes itself known, not by seeking attention, but by aiming to last. Once this is understood, the past ceases to feel chaotic and begins to reveal its purpose. Perhaps those quiet seasons weren't empty at all. They were completing the kind of work that noise can't accomplish. If this reflection resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey has offered new clarity on your own faith, consider subscribing for more insights building on this foundation. Don't rush off just yet. The next video dives even deeper and might challenge a long-held assumption you've been holding on to.